Good evening. I'm sorry we're late, but we've had a few technical difficulties. I'm Chris, and I'll be speaking to Caroline Stephens. And what we're speaking about tonight is, firstly, how Caroline first found out about what I call the Soviet EU. And then we go on to looking at, if that's okay with you, Caroline, I believe that the EU has the finest PR that our taxes can pay for. And when you've got the finest PR that our taxes can pay for, you can't really go far wrong, can you? I mean, you could have the worst dictatorship in the world, but if it's got the finest PR, then you're going to get a lot of people following it. So first of all, how did you first get into finding out about the EU and thinking, well, it's not quite right what we're being told? When did you first when did you first get the inclination that there's something not quite right going on?
Well, it was just simply because I was just embarking on my normal day-to-day life, knew nothing about the European Union. I remember seeing Cod Wars and Butter Mountains from way back, but I never really gave it any thought. And then just went to a chance public meeting that was organised in the town, March 2013, and it was a day that changed my life. Listening to people who worked in the European Union talk about how we were spending so much money to this unelected bureaucracy, and it just didn't feel right at all. And I mean, it was just a light bulb moment. I couldn't understand why anybody would support this. So stood for election for the local council, stood for parliament, but I foretold that even though we'd voted to leave, we wasn't going to be coming out anytime soon, and it's being proved to be the case now.
Well, look at the Marrakesh Agreement. Now, I have made a point of telling people about the Marrakesh Agreement, and before I saw your brilliant broadcast, and I advised people to look at that, I believe it's on YouTube, I didn't know anything about it. And I speak to quite a few people, and I said, do you know the Marrakesh Agreement? I said, what's that? What? Not one.
Yes, I did that video, didn't I, on my YouTube channel? On the Marrakesh Declaration. I've got it on my
Declaration. Terribly sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
I've got it on my YouTube channel, and that's made me think. Well, so we're trying to clear Africa of people. This is what the world government's doing, clearing Africa of the people, so that they can go in and collect all the goodies, all the commodities that Africa has to offer.
Yeah. Yes. And I've noticed right the way through, I mean, when Traitor Heath, as I call him, first got us into the common market, people then were beginning to think there's something odd. But because if you look at document, and this is off the top of my head, 30/1048, and this is an official document, it shows you how Ted Heath committed treason. And there is strangely enough, a BBC documentary that was made about 20 years ago that looked into, I don't think they mentioned that document number because I don't think it had been released at that time, but they were talking about how they changed public perception of the then common market. And now, please don't quote me on this. This is off the top of my head. I think it was only about 16% of people were pro common market, and they, with their PR and manipulation of the BBC and the mass media and the civil service writing fake letters into newspapers praising the common market to the hilt, raised that figure. I think it was to 48 or 50%. But please don't quote me on those figures. That's off the top of my head, and I think they're slightly wrong. But it was around about that margin. It was from a very low figure to a very high figure, thanks to their propaganda.
Well, they had lots of money at their disposal. I believe it was the CIA that started the ball rolling because they wanted us to join the EEC. And sure enough, the language, the materials used for both sides, they actually did analyze the reading age of both sides, and for people to be encouraged to stay in the EEC, that average reading age was lower. So it was much easier for people to understand. It's very simple language. And I guess people were maybe, it was all about jobs, the single market, and cheap holidays, I guess. Cheap holidays, I'm sure, was at the top of many people's list of priorities at that point.
Well, it's the goodies, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the old film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, there's the child catcher. And he says, "Here, children, some sweeties for you. Come with me. There's some sweeties." And that's, I believe, how the EU has survived, by offering people little sweeties, but it's a bitter aftertaste. And people don't realise what they're being led into. And again, it's brilliant propaganda. I mean, I've seen on Facebook Stephen Fry, a man I can't stand, doing a pro EU propaganda broadcast. And the way he speaks, it's such a marvellous organisation. It's stupid not to go along with it and all that. Have you seen that broadcast?
No, I haven't. But I guess the way the media is plays this out is, at the front of the Sky News, you've got Brexit crisis now, and those are the two words. Crisis always has a very negative connotation. So they're basically saying leaving the EU is very negative for us personally. And when they go out in the streets and interview people, chances are they will interview far more people that wish to remain in the EU than which want to leave. And of course, the vote has happened, but we've got to move on. And the Boris deal has been played out insofar as it's a good deal. It's so much better than Theresa May's deal. But then you've got the other side of the coin. You've got people like Nigel Farage saying, no, it's 95% of May's deal. And yeah, sure enough. I mean, what have we got? Taxation without representation. In fact, I made a few notes. Britain remains under the EU rules with no vote, no voice, no veto. No vote, no voice, no veto. And we're looking at towards the end of 2020 now. You see, we're nearing the fruition, I say, of the Lisbon Treaty, because we're already in the Lisbon Treaty, and that's what hasn't helped us on our side, because a lot of Brexiteers have thought that it's all just happening now over the next 2 years. But in actual fact, we're coming to the end of the Lisbon Treaty.
Yes. Ex-President Gorbachev of Russia of the Soviet Union, said that the EU, and this is his own words, is an extension of their Politburo. He's actually said that. And that was way back in the 1990s.
But, I mean, we're looking at, there's a much bigger picture here. It's not just about the EU, because as we've discussed before, the councils in England and Wales, they are now sort of directly responsible to the United Nations. So when one of the constitutional experts had suggested to people on my stream, a live stream about the Lisbon Treaty, that perhaps we should take the matter to the United Nations if there's a problem in Parliament, how can we go to the very perpetrators who are behind the EU? I mean, the United Nations is in charge of the EU. The EU is it's like a layer, it's an onion, isn't it? You just peel off the layers. And what's at the end of it? You're looking at a one world religion. You're looking at an eradication of the indigenous population of the UK and places like, the original indigenous Germans. And you see all the uprising now on the continent. And there's lots of talk of EU tanks over here. They've been here, I think, since the beginning of the year. And what they're going to do, they've got the logos on the sides of the tanks. What's that all about? We can't stop them. This is the thing. We're still part of the EU. Nothing's changed apart from, we're still going to be paying in money each month, each day.
That's it. But what gets me about the EU, if you were, say, an alien from another planet and you came down to Earth and you saw what has happened, our fishing industry has been completely decimated. The coal industry, non-existent. Now people say, oh, it's a fossil fuel, blah, 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 blah. But I remember when they were closing down the coal mines, they said there are 400 years worth of coal under the UK. That was what the experts said at that time in the early 80s when Arthur Scargill was doing his bit. Now, coal-fired power stations have got scrubbers on with modern technology. They are super clean, very clean. And I believe that the EU, UN, and all this climate change garbage is all tied up. It's all neatly tied together for this, as you quite rightly say, one world government. And it's a long process. And what we're going through is the stages of ideological subversion, which I've mentioned umpteen times before, and I'm probably boring people to death with it. But
well,
really,
you've got global Marxism, haven't you? So basically, you're looking at a one world religion. So one of the key parts of global Marxism is ensuring that the church pews empty. And I did a show last Saturday night which put the spotlight on the Archbishop of Canterbury.
oh,
You know, he's the head of the Church of England, and who is he? You know, so I investigated the fact that he'd been working in the oil industry, which is a very roughy tufty industry to be in, a bit like politics.
ruthless.
And he was involved in that, and then he just had a God moment and decided he ought to enter the church, which was quite an about turn, and to go from that industry to but of course, where they end up when you're an archbishop, and he was catapulted into that position in a relatively short space of time, is the fact that he can sit and walk the corridors of Parliament, and he actually has real authority in, I guess, in the physical realm, because once he's appointed there, he speaks for the whole of the church, something like 80 million people worldwide. He's going and visiting the Pope and having these discussions about prayers and poverty and immigration. And strangely, he's talking about poverty, but it doesn't show on any website, it would appear, what he actually earns from this, from his activities of pontificating to the rest of us.
Well, it's Satanism, I believe, because have you been to London recently and seen some of these very, very strange, inverted commas, sculptures